and we'll hand over to Patrick. So, Patrick Watson, please take it away.
Thanks, Dom. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining me for this session. And as Dom said, so what I'll be doing is exploring the threat and opportunities associated with Microsoft's communication portfolio. As Dom said, I joined Cavell at the start of the year. Previous to that, I was a consultant in a Microsoft Gold partner organization for several years, and I was a technology journalist after that. And since the start of the year at joining Cavell, I've been focused very much on collaboration, and a lot of that focus has been on Microsoft. So Microsoft is one of the areas where we get the most interest from service providers who are trying to understand more about Microsoft's proposition to the industry. So in this session, I wanted to use some of our research to look at that in a bit more detail. So first of all, I wanted to try and explain why Microsoft is so important and why it's become such an area of focus for the cloud communications industry. I think, first of all, you have to acknowledge Microsoft's pure size and market presence. It's one of the world's biggest companies in general, and also is one of the world's most recognizable technology brands. In France specifically, Microsoft has a pretty huge presence. After launching in the market back at the start of the 90s, the French market provides nearly $1.5 billion in revenue for Microsoft, and it employs over 1,000 staff locally. The French government and Microsoft announced, I think it was last year, that they were collaborating on cybersecurity standards and policies. So Microsoft plays a pretty important role in the technology landscape in the French market. Outside of its size and scale and reputation, another key reason that Microsoft is such a focus for the cloud communications industry is threat perception. The research you can see on screen comes from a number of separate research reports and studies that we've commissioned at Cavell. It started back in 2019 in conjunction with the Cloud Communications Alliance, and we asked a selection of service providers what they considered to be the greatest threat to the status quo within the cloud communications market, and whether they thought that threat would increase. The top response was that Microsoft was seen as the biggest threat. We've asked the same question in subsequent studies, and that threat perception has actually increased each time we've asked the question. So from the service provider perspective, Microsoft is seen as the biggest growing threat to the current market status. I think another area that makes Microsoft so important is its position and direct access to end users with its provision of the Microsoft Office suite. So the stats you can see on screen are global stats. And I'll look specifically at the French data throughout this presentation, but I think this is important from a global perspective. Microsoft, depending on what data you use, appears to control market share in the desktop productivity applications. And this direct access to an end user's desktop gives it a real advantage when it comes to promoting other applications such as Microsoft Teams. The majority of users are familiar already with a Microsoft user interface, and that in turn helps to drive adoption of further Microsoft products. So now I wanted to look specifically at Microsoft's development in the communication markets globally. And I think when Microsoft was founded in 1975, there was no real focus on communications. That area has been developed through the acquisition of third-party organizations who specialized in different areas. So you can go back earlier than this, but I've started with its $8.5 billion acquisition of Skype in 2011, which led to the development of Skype for Business. But there have been other key purchases. IP from Torco Inc. was used in the development of the Microsoft Teams mobile application. And more recently this year, we've seen a series of acquisitions of Affirmed Networks and also Metaswitch, which have amplified Microsoft's networking and communications capability and expertise. And also, I don't expect this to stop either. I think you can expect to see Microsoft make further acquisitions to bolster different areas of its portfolio in the future. When a lot of people think about Microsoft when it comes to communications, they instantly think about Microsoft Teams. So Teams is a big part of Microsoft's communication story, but it is by no means the whole picture. I think Teams, Skype, and now increasingly Azure are key assets that form the Microsoft communications umbrella. As Matt mentioned earlier in his keynote this morning, Microsoft Teams has seen extraordinary growth now with 115 million daily active users, but we shouldn't forget about Skype. There's still an installed base of millions of users using Skype for Business server editions, and there's also still a substantial base of Skype for Business Online customers who will need to be migrated over to Teams before Skype for Business Online specifically is made end of life in the summer of next year, 2021. So we shouldn't neglect Skype and that install base as a big part of Microsoft's communication story. However, I think the key piece of the puzzle now is Microsoft Azure, and that's for a number of key reasons, but chiefly a heightened focus on communications capability from Microsoft. The launch of Azure for Operators and also Azure Communication Services affirms that heightened focus from Microsoft. So this slide comes from our enterprise research and shows how popular cloud infrastructure platforms are as more and more businesses that look to leverage public and hybrid cloud deployments for all of their technology. So though this is where the real revenue opportunities are for Microsoft. And so that increased focus on communications capability within Azure is designed to attract service providers, telcos, and operators to leverage Azure for different services. Microsoft obviously has big competition in this area from people like Google, Amazon, IBM. So it's an area generally where we're seeing a real arms race in terms of the development of those communication capabilities. I think the launch earlier this year of Azure for Operators is probably the most relevant bit of news for the cloud communications industry. So Finbar, my colleague who was speaking before, and Matt, who did his keynote this morning, published a full webinar on this topic, which is available free of charge from Cavell. So if you want the full details of our take on that launch, you can take a look at that. But effectively, Azure for Operators offers a bespoke set of cloud services targeted at service providers, telcos, and operators. Microsoft want you to move your services and systems into the cloud and into Azure specifically. So this is another area where we're going to see more announcements and more news over the next couple of years as the proposition within Azure develops. So that was a touch on Azure, which I think is a key part of the Microsoft story. Let's have a look at Microsoft Teams now. So Teams is particularly relevant for the cloud comms industry because of, firstly, its popularity, which has definitely been assisted by the pandemic, but also because of the potential integration of telephony services into Teams. So as most of you will know, Microsoft Teams doesn't include telephony services as standard, but you can add telephony or voice into Teams through one of two routes. You can use Microsoft calling plans or direct routing. Calling plans use Microsoft as the end-to-end carrier to provide PSTN connectivity. The other option, which is by far the more popular of the two, is direct routing, which uses third parties to connect to the PSTN. So at Cavell, we've conducted a lot of research in this area. So if anyone is interested in more details on calling plans versus direct routing, please do get in touch during or after the show, and we'd be happy to go into that. A couple of interesting stats on Teams. This data comes from a survey we commissioned at the start of the pandemic with over 60 service providers taking part. We wanted to find out how the pandemic had impacted the market. So we asked what products end customers had been asking for, and you can see that 60% of the service providers had been asked for Microsoft Teams specifically by name. So that just goes to show its popularity during the pandemic. Matt had this data in his presentation too, but I've tweaked it slightly to focus on Teams. So this is from our Enterprise Insight report, and asked customers about the technology solutions that they were aware of. And as you can see, after Zoom, Microsoft Teams was the big winner here, with awareness increasing from a pretty high starting point anyway by over 18%. So let's have a look at the French market specifically. I've helpfully highlighted France on the map here, just in case any of you didn't know where it was. But effectively, France is a pretty big market for Microsoft Teams. So we've used a combination of sources to approximate these numbers, as Microsoft don't reveal them directly. So we've used our research, interviews with the service provider community, discussions with Microsoft, and also with Microsoft's partners, such as the session border controller vendors, to try and come up with some of these figures. So we think that there are about 1.75 million Teams users in France, and those are just basic collaboration application only users. And we expect that number to rise to over 2 million in 2021, according to our current forecasts. In terms of telephony, our data shows that there are under 100,000 Microsoft Teams users in France with telephony-enabled capability, but we expect that to grow pretty rapidly. And the vast majority of those telephony or voice users will be using direct routing rather than calling plans. And we think there's probably only a few thousand using Microsoft calling plans in France at the moment. So one question we get all the time at Cavell is, where are the opportunities for service providers when it comes to Teams? And I think most of you are aware that the partner model when working with Microsoft is very different to the traditional communications vendor partner models that you might be used to. But I'll come back onto that in a bit more detail later on. So the first area that provides an opportunity is through direct routing. So as we saw earlier, direct routing is by far the most popular way to add voice or telephony into Teams, over and above Microsoft calling plans. And the provision of third-party telephony products is a big growth and development area. At Cavell, we've had a look at markets globally to see what products people are offering. And we've broken it down into a few categories which are on screen here. First, basic access. So many providers are now offering basic access for Teams by providing SIP trunks. A basic SIP trunk provision would allow an enterprise to connect their own or a third-party managed session border controller device to the PSTN network to provide connectivity into Microsoft Teams. The middle tier is what we're calling direct routing as a service. So this is an option which is designed to allow organizations to enable telephony services within Teams whilst removing the need for an enterprise to manage on-premises infrastructure or possess the in-house technical expertise to configure it. So generally, direct routing as a service products include the SIP connectivity, managed SBC resource, and options covering carrier services such as phone numbers and minutes. The final option, and this is an area where we think we're going to see real growth, is this enhanced Microsoft Teams telephony service. So offering all the features of direct routing as a service, an enhanced telephony solution includes some further benefits. So vendors and providers will overlay additional PBX functionality, so enabling an enterprise to overcome any potential shortcomings in the Microsoft phone system. These enhanced telephony offers also include often improved integration capabilities, enhanced support, because at the moment Microsoft only offers 99.9% SLA on Teams, which isn't necessarily the highest industry standard. And often as well with these advanced telephony offers, you get more detailed analytics and reporting capability. So on the next slide, I've just highlighted some providers in the French market who are already offering Teams telephony solutions, and they're quite widely available now. So providers like our sponsors today in Reach, but also people like SFR, Saywan, and Orange have telephony integration options available. We expect to see this market grow significantly over the next few years, and this is because more and more end user organizations are going to look to add telephony capability into their Microsoft Teams tenancies. Another area of opportunity is contact center. So Microsoft Teams really doesn't have much native customer engagement capability inbuilt. So this is a big area where providers can look to add value. As you can see on screen, a number of providers have already either looked to partner with Microsoft in its contact center certification program, or to utilize the available Teams APIs to develop contact center integrations for Teams. So as I mentioned before, the Microsoft partner model is very different to the traditional cloud comms vendor partner model that many service providers, telcos and operators will be used to. The license margins available from Microsoft are likely to be significantly reduced, probably a maximum of 15%. But from my personal experience, I think you'd be very lucky to see anything like that level of margin on a Microsoft license. So Microsoft partners need to look to supplementary and supporting areas to generate revenue and margin. And I've tried to highlight some of those on screen here that would relate to Teams specifically. So just to conclude really quickly, a few things for service providers to consider when you're thinking about your Microsoft strategy. So Teams is undeniably going to take further market share. So service providers need a defined strategy. So either a supporting product in telephony or contact center, or a competitive alternative offering. There's still a substantial base of Skype for Business customers who will be looking to migrate away from Skype to Teams as platform development slows. So service providers need to consider their own migration options and pathways there. Microsoft is very keen to promote Azure services to service providers and the telco community. So careful consideration is required when you consider the potential benefits of moving services and systems to Azure, whilst also taking into account possible risks when you're cloudifying network functions and moving them to a cloud infrastructure platform. The last two, I think, demand for specialists who can offer integration. We've seen increasing adoption of multiple vendor solutions and telephony experts who can assist with configuration, installation, and management of integrated communication solutions that include contact center and the network solutions that Finbar was talking about previously will potentially be able to drive the most value. And finally, I think considering your business model is going to be key. Are you set up to partner with Microsoft using their existing partner model, or would you be better to explore alternative options? Service providers and telcos and operators need to examine all the possible options in detail to make sure they make the right choice. That's it from me. We've got much more detail and research on Microsoft. I could have gone on for hours, as the team here knows. So if anyone has any follow-up questions, please do get in touch. But for now, that is everything from me. And I think very shortly we'll be back with Metaswitch. But thanks for joining me for that.